What would you do if you discovered that your real family name had been hidden for decades, passed down from generation to generation through whispers on a deathbed? In the cold spring of 2024, in the basement of an old house on the outskirts of Kharkiv, one discovery overturned historians' understanding of how far people might go to protect their belonging to a place they call home. Yellowed pages of a family book, smelling of mold and time, held a secret that began more than 120 years ago, when the city still belonged to the Russian Empire. The secret of the Kravtsov family, who changed their names every spring in order to stay alive. If you're interested in this grim story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other forgotten pages of our history. Anna Sokolova never imagined that a simple restoration of an old house on Pushkinska Street would lead to a discovery that would keep her up at night. This house belonged to her great-grandfather, and she decided to restore it after her grandmother's death. The house had stood abandoned for almost 40 years since the family moved to a new apartment in the 1980s. Dust lay in a thick layer over the antique furniture, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like silver threads connecting the present with the past. On that April day, Anna went down to the basement to check the condition of the foundation. Cold, musty air enveloped her as she shone a flashlight into the space that had not seen light for decades. In the far corner, under a pile of old newspapers and rags, she noticed a strange protrusion in the wall. When Anna moved the rubble, a small niche opened before her, disguised as an ordinary foundation stone. Inside lay a metal box the size of a book, surprisingly well-preserved despite the dampness of the basement. "I remember how my hands trembled when I opened this box," Anna recounted later. "The smell of old paper hit me in the nose, and when I saw the date on the first page, 1901, I was breathless. It wasn't just an old book, it was a book of fates." Inside the box, Anna found a thick notebook in a leather binding, several photographs wrapped in waxed paper, and a strange amulet. A small silver circle with a symbol engraved on it, resembling a stylized tree with roots turning into branches. But the most surprising thing was the notebook, written in small, neat handwriting, beginning with the words, "The Testament of the Kravtsov family, compiled by Stepan Kravtsov for our descendants, so that the thread of our existence is not broken." Anna spent the whole night reading the notes of her ancestor by the light of a table lamp. Her eyes widened with surprise and horror as she delved into a history that had never been mentioned in family conversations. She couldn't believe that her family, which she considered ordinary, was hiding such a dark secret. According to the records of Stepan Kravtsov, their family had lived in Kharkiv since the very founding of the city in the mid-15th century. They were among the first settlers to come to these lands in search of a new life. But what began as an ordinary family chronicle soon turned into something much more disturbing. On March 23, 1887, I, Stepan Kravtsov, witnessed an event that changed the fate of our family forever, the author of the diary wrote. That day, my father, Nikolai Kravtsov, was summoned to the city council. He did not return home, neither in the evening nor the next day. When I went to look for him, I was told that a man with that name had never been summoned. Moreover, in the registration books of Kharkiv residents, there was no Nikolai Kravtsov. My father disappeared not only physically, he was erased from the official records, as if he had never existed. Historian Igor Melnik from Kharkiv National University, who studied the diary, explains that what Stepan Kravtsov describes is not unique to that era. At the end of the 19th century, the Russian Empire was experiencing a period of increased bureaucratic control and national politics. People of certain nationalities or faiths could suddenly find themselves outlawed, lose their property, or even their lives. But what happened to the Kravtsov family goes beyond ordinary historical processes. According to the diary, a week after his father's disappearance, Stepan met an old man in the market who took him aside and whispered, "I knew your father. He was a good man, but he forgot to change his name this spring, and they took him. If you want to survive, follow the testament of the family." Stepan did not understand what the old man was talking about, but he insisted on meeting in the evening in an abandoned chapel in the old cemetery. There Stepan met several other people who introduced themselves with different surnames, but they all claimed to have known his father. They told me that our family, like several others in Kharkiv, belongs to a special group of people whom the local authorities periodically track down and destroy, Stepan wrote. No one really knew the reason. Some spoke of an ancient curse, others that our ancestors were keepers of some forbidden knowledge. But everyone agreed on one thing. In order to survive, we must change our names every spring, while remaining ourselves for those who know the secret. Anthropologist Elena Kovalenko, specializing in the folklore of eastern Ukraine, comments. In Slavic cultures, spring was traditionally associated with renewal and rebirth. There were rituals associated with changing names in order to deceive evil spirits. But the case of the Kravtsov family is unique in that this practice continued in a modernizing society and was associated not with mythological creatures, but with very real persecutions. But what Anna discovered next made her blood run cold. The diary described a ritual that Stepan had to perform to protect himself and his family, a ritual he called the spring renewal. According to the records, on the night of the spring equinox, Stepan had to go to the cemetery, find the grave of a person who died in the current year, and take a handful of earth. Then, mixing this earth with his own blood, he had to apply the tree symbol to his forehead, the very one that was engraved on the amulet from the box. After that, he chose a new surname, the surname of the deceased person, and within 3 days, he drew up all the necessary documents to officially change the name of his family. The strangest thing, notes Igor Melnik, is that the archives of Kharkiv really contain documents on the change of surnames by some residents in the period from 1887 to 1917. Moreover, many of these changes occurred in the spring. Previously, historians attributed this to migration processes or errors in record-keeping, but Kravtsov's diary makes us look at these facts in a new way. But why spring specifically? The answer to this question was received from the elder of the group, a person whom he calls only the guardian in the diary. According to his story, in the 15th century, when Kharkiv was founded, the first settlers discovered an ancient pagan temple in these places. Despite the warnings of local residents, they destroyed the sanctuary and built a church on its site. Soon after, a strange disease began in the city. People lost their memory, forgot who they were, and died in terrible agony. Then one of the priests, a former pagan, offered a ritual of renewal of names. He claimed that the creatures disturbed by the destruction of the pagan temple take souls through names. By changing names every spring when these entities awaken, people could avoid their attention. Those who followed the ritual survived. Those who forgot or refused disappeared. Of course, from the point of view of modern science, all this sounds like superstition, says Elena Kovalenko. But it is important to understand that, for the people of that time, the line between reality and the supernatural was much more blurred. In addition, behind such beliefs, there were often very real dangers, such as persecution for religious or ethnic motives. However, what happened next is difficult to explain rationally. Stepan described cases when people who missed the name change ritual really disappeared without a trace, and not only they themselves but also all mentions of them in official documents, as if someone or something systematically erased them from reality. But what they discovered next did not fit into any framework of rational explanation. The diary described a case when Stepan decided to follow a man who was supposed to disappear in the coming days due to violation of the ritual. His name was Mikhail Zorin, and he openly mocked old superstitions. I followed Zorin for 3 days, Stepan wrote. On the 4th day, he entered the building of the city council and never came out of there. I waited until closing, but he wasn't there. The next day, I asked the employees about him, but no one remembered a man with that name. I showed them a photograph of Zorin, which I took a week ago in a photo studio on Sumska Street, but they looked at the card in bewilderment, as if they saw a blank sheet. When I returned home and looked at the photograph again, there was no one on it, only an empty chair in the photo studio. Criminologist Alexander Vishnevsky from the Kiev Institute of Forensic Examinations believes. The diary of Kravtsov describes the classic signs of a paranoid state, caused possibly by mass hysteria or poisoning with some substances. History knows many such cases, from the dancing plague of the Middle Ages to cases of mass hysteria in closed communities. It is quite possible that the Kravtsov family and their acquaintances became victims of such a phenomenon. However, other specialists are not so categorical in their assessments. Historian Melnik notes, In the archives of that period, there really are strange gaps. For example, the census of the population of Kharkiv in 1897 contains a numbering of pages indicating that some sheets were removed, and in church books, there are records of baptisms and funerals of people about whom there are no other mentions. According to the diary, by 1901, Stepan Kravtsov, following the tradition, had already changed his family's surname several times. They were Kravtsovs, Sokolovs, Belozerskis, Karpenkos, and again returned to the Kravtsov surname. Each time, they moved to another district of the city, introduced themselves as new residents, and no one except a narrow circle of their own knew about their real history. It was hardest to explain to the children why we constantly change names, Stepan wrote. My daughter, Maria, once almost revealed our secret when the teacher at school asked her real name. Fortunately, I taught the children to answer that they do not remember what they were called before. At that time, many families moved to Kharkiv from the villages, and such forgetfulness did not cause much suspicion. But the system of changing names was only part of a more complex survival mechanism. The Kravtsovs and other families belonging to their group created a whole underground network of mutual assistance. They helped each other with documents, housing, work. They had secret signs and passwords by which they recognized their own, even after changing names. We gathered once a month in different places, Stepan wrote, sometimes in the basement of someone's house, sometimes in abandoned buildings on the outskirts of the city. Everyone brought a list of the new names of their family, so that everyone knew how to address each other in front of strangers. We also shared information about those who violated the ritual and disappeared. With each year, there were fewer of them. People learned to be careful. However, what Anna discovered next in the diary made her doubt the mental health of her ancestor. Stepan began to describe strange cases when he allegedly saw those who had disappeared, but they looked like shadows of themselves, pale, with an empty gaze, as if devoid of a soul. Yesterday, I met Zoran on the street, Stepan recorded in April 1903. He was walking in the crowd, but no one except me paid attention to him. His skin was gray, his eyes empty. When I called out to him, he turned to me, and I saw that behind his back stood a tall figure in black, with a face hidden by a hood. The figure put his hand on Zoran's shoulder, and they both dissolved into the crowd. I ran after them, but they disappeared, as if they had never been. Psychiatrist Natalia Bereznaya, after reading these records, comments, "Here we see the classic symptoms of schizophrenia or another psychotic disorder. Hallucinations, paranoid ideas, persecution, belief in supernatural forces controlling the fates of people. Perhaps the initial trauma, the disappearance of his father, triggered the process of developing the disease in Stepan Kravtsov." However, Anna herself was not so categorical. When I read these lines, I also thought at first that my great-grandfather suffered from some kind of mental disorder, she recounted. But then I found the photographs that were in the box, and what I saw did not fit into the framework of a simple explanation. The photographs that Anna spoke about were a series of snapshots taken on the streets of Kharkiv in the early 20th century. At first glance, ordinary city scenes. People walking down the street, sitting in the park, standing at the entrance to a store. But upon closer examination, in the background of some of the shots, one could notice blurry figures that seemed to be watching what was happening, figures in dark clothing, whose faces could not be discerned. Of course, these may be just defects in the photographic plates or the result of a long exposure, explains photographer and photography historian Mikhail Levchenko. At that time, photography was still an imperfect art, and such artifacts often arose for technical reasons. But it is interesting that these figures appear on different shots taken at different times and possibly by different photographers. This is already more difficult to explain by mere chance. But the most disturbing thing was that, on the back of each photograph, Stepan wrote the names of people who soon disappeared. Next to the blurry figures, he noted, "They have already chosen the next victim." However, what they discovered next defied any rational explanation. In the diary, Stepan described a meeting with a man whom he called the Observer. This happened in the winter of 1905, when Kharkiv was engulfed in revolutionary unrest. "He approached me on the street when I was returning from work," Stepan wrote. "A tall man in a black coat and hat. His face was ordinary, but his eyes, His eyes were too old for his face, as if something ancient was hidden behind a young shell. He knew my real name, knew about our ritual, knew everything. "You think you're fooling us with your name changes," he said. "We just let you live because you are interesting to us. Playing hide and seek with desperate mice has always amused higher beings." According to the diary, the observer explained to Stepan that the beings they feared were much older and more powerful than people thought. They were neither demons nor spirits in the traditional sense. They were something like guardians of balance who periodically thinned out the human population, taking those who violated certain rules. He told me that the ritual of changing names works, not because it deceives them, Stepan recorded, but because it demonstrates our readiness for change, our flexibility. Those who cling to one name, one personality, become rigid, predictable, useless, he said. We take them to make room for those who are able to evolve. Psychologist Oleg Savchenko, specializing in the study of cults and closed communities, comments, "In the records of Kravtsov, we see a classic example of how a group of people creates a complex mythology to explain traumatic events. Probably the families he writes about were really persecuted, possibly for religious or ethnic reasons, and the ritual of changing names was a real survival strategy. But over time, this practice became overgrown with mystical explanations that helped people make sense of what was happening. However, further entries in the diary became increasingly disturbing. Stepan described how, after meeting the observer, he began to notice these creatures everywhere. They hid among ordinary people, watching and choosing new victims. He claimed that he had learned to see their true essence. Shadows standing behind the backs of unsuspecting passers-by. "I can no longer sleep at night," he described in November 1905. "I see them even with my eyes closed. They know that I know about them and it amuses them. Sometimes they come to my house and look in the windows. My wife and children do not see them, but the dog feels it. She whines and hides under the bed when they are near." By 1907, the entries in the diary were becoming increasingly disjointed. Stepan wrote about his attempts to warn others about the true nature of the creatures, but he was considered crazy. The group split up. Some continued to follow the ritual of changing names. Others decided that it was just an outdated superstition. "They don't understand that the game has become more serious," Stepan wrote. "Now it's not enough to just change names. They are looking for those who can see them, who know the truth. And they have found me." The last entry in the diary is dated March 1908. "Today I saw them at the school where my daughter studies. They were looking at her, and I know that they have chosen her as the next. Cannot allow this. There is only one way to save my family. I must divert their attention to myself. I will not change my name this spring. I will remain Stepan Kravtsov and accept what must happen. But before that, I will hide the diary and the amulet where my family can find them when the time comes. I know that one day someone from my descendants will read these lines and understand what needs to be done. Remember, they are always watching, but we can learn to see them first." After this entry, the diary broke off. Anna turned to the family archives to find out what happened to Stepan Kravtsov, but found no mention of his death, as if he had really disappeared without a trace, as he had predicted in his diary. "I started asking relatives," Anna recounted. "No one remembered Stepan Kravtsov. My grandmother said that her grandfather's name was Sokolov, and before that, he was Belozersky. No one in our family ever mentioned the Kravtsovs. But when I showed my grandmother the photograph from the box, she turned pale. 'Where did you find this?' she asked. We should never have talked about it." According to Anna's grandmother's story, their family had indeed changed their surnames until the revolution of 1917. After the establishment of Soviet power, this practice became too dangerous. The new state strictly monitored the documents of citizens, and frequent changes of surnames could attract unwanted attention. "But we found another way," her grandmother confessed. "We moved from city to city every few years. Kharkiv, Kiev, Odessa, Rostov, again Kharkiv. In each new place, we were new people with new biographies. And always in the spring, before moving, we performed the ritual with the amulet. I remember how my father dripped blood on the silver circle and whispered something. Then I thought it was just an old superstition, but now, historian Melnick notes. Paradoxically, but the Soviet period, with its mass migrations, evacuations during the war, repressions, and confusion in documents, created ideal conditions for families like the Kravtsovs. People constantly lost documents, changed places of residence, disappeared without a trace. In this chaos, it was easy to get lost and become someone else. But what is even more surprising, Anna's grandmother admitted, is that their family continued to follow the ritual even in the post-war period. They no longer changed surnames officially, but every spring they held a symbolic renewal ceremony. They gathered as a family. The eldest man applied the sign of the tree to the forehead of each family member using a mixture of earth from the cemetery and a few drops of blood. After that, all family members used other names and surnames in conversations among themselves for a week. My father always said that it was just a tribute to tradition, her grandmother recounted. But he never missed the ritual even during the war in evacuation. He found a way to get earth from the cemetery and hold the ceremony exactly on the day of the spring equinox. And no one in our family ever went missing, never died under strange circumstances. Even during the war, when people disappeared by the thousands, all of ours survived. Anna was shocked by these revelations. She had never noticed any strange rituals being performed in their family. But her grandmother explained that after her father's death in the 1980s, the tradition was interrupted. None of the younger generation knew about the real history of the family, about the secret of their origin. Perhaps that's why we found the box only now, Anna suggested. It was waiting until one of us was ready to learn the truth. But the longer Anna studied the diary and talked with her grandmother, the more questions she had. If the creatures described by Stepan were real, why did they stop hunting their family? Or did they just lie low, waiting for the Kravtsovs to forget about the ritual and become vulnerable? I started noticing strange things, Anna confessed. People who look at me for too long on the street, figures that I see out of the corner of my eye, but when I turn around, there's no one there. Maybe it's just autosuggestion after reading the diary. But what if it's not? What if they really exist and are now watching me? Psychologist Savchenko warns that this is a classic example of how a strong impression from what is read can influence the perception of reality. Anna found a diary that describes paranormal phenomena, and now her brain begins to interpret ordinary events through the prism of this information. This is a normal psychological reaction, but it is important not to delve too deeply into such ideas. However, not all specialists are so skeptical. Anthropologist Kovalenko notes, in the history of mankind, there are many rituals and beliefs that at first glance seem irrational, but upon closer examination turn out to be adaptive survival mechanisms. Perhaps the Kravtsov family and other similar groups were really subjected to systematic persecution, and the ritual of changing names was their way of adapting to a hostile environment. Historian Melnick adds, we must not forget that the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century was a period of intensive social changes, revolutions, and wars. In such conditions, people often turn to mystical explanations of what is happening, seek protection in rituals and secret societies. But behind these superstitions, there may be very real threats and survival strategies. But what they discovered next made all the experts reconsider their initial assessments. Anna decided to check the information from the diary and turned to the city archive of Kharkiv. There she found documents confirming the existence of Stepan Kravtsov and his family until 1908. But after March of that year, the last dates in the diary, any mentions of him disappeared. At the same time, the documents contained evidence of his wife Alexandra and daughter Maria, who changed their surname to Sokolov's in May 1908. In the certificate of change of surname, the reason given was the death of the head of the family, but no documents confirming the death of Stepan Kravtsov were found in the archive. This may be simply a consequence of bureaucratic errors of that time, explains archivist Ekaterina Polishchik. Documents were lost, destroyed during the revolution and wars. The fact that we did not find evidence of death does not mean that he did not exist. However, Anna was not satisfied with this explanation. She continued her search and discovered that similar cases, the disappearance of people without a trace and without documentary confirmation of death, occurred in Kharkiv regularly in the period from 1880 to 1917. And, most strangely, most of these disappearances occurred in the spring period. I compiled a list of 27 cases when people disappeared in a similar way, Anna recounted. And in 22 cases, this happened between March 20th and April 20th. Too much of a coincidence to be accidental. Criminologist Vishnevsky comments. Spring has always been a period of increased social activity. People came out of hibernation, construction work, trade, and migration began. Naturally, more incidents of various kinds occurred during this period, including disappearances. In addition, in the spring, the snow melted, and the bodies of people who had disappeared in the winter were often found. These factors could create the impression that spring is especially dangerous. But Anna was not convinced by these rational explanations. She continued to study the diary and photographs, trying to understand what really happened to her ancestor and why their family was so afraid to forget the ritual of changing names. One of the most disturbing moments came when Anna decided to show the photographs from the box to a specialist in historical photography. The expert confirmed that the pictures were indeed taken in the early 20th century, but he was puzzled by the blurry figures in the background. This does not look like ordinary artifacts of the photographic process of that time, he concluded. It seems that these figures moved much faster than ordinary people, so they turned out to be so blurry. But the speed of movement would have to be inhuman to create such an effect. When Anna tried to scan the photographs to preserve digital copies, using the exposure settings that were common at the time, something strange happened. On the scans, the blurred figures were absent, as if they existed only on the original prints and could not be copied by modern technology. I took the photographs to a forensic laboratory, Anna recounted. There, I was told that the pictures showed no signs of manipulation or editing. The photographs are authentic, taken with equipment from the early 20th century. But the expert refused to comment on the blurred figures, saying only that he had never seen anything like it. All these oddities made Anna wonder, what if Stepan's diary described reality? What if the creatures he called observers really existed and continue to exist now? And what will happen if their family completely forgets the ritual that has protected them for over 100 years? I decided to conduct an experiment, Anna confessed. This year, on the day of the spring equinox, I performed the ritual as it was described in the diary. I took soil from a cemetery, mixed it with a drop of my blood, and applied a tree symbol to my forehead. Then, I chose a new name, Maria Belozerskaya, in honor of Stepan's daughter and one of our family's past surnames. Psychologist Savchenko warns, such experiments can be psychologically dangerous. By immersing themselves in rituals, especially those associated with mystical beliefs, a person may experience strong emotional reactions, even temporary psychotic episodes. I would strongly recommend that Anna consult a specialist before continuing her research. However, Anna claims that after performing the ritual, she began to notice changes. The first thing I noticed was that the blurred figures in the photographs became less distinct, as if they were receding. Then, I began to feel that I was no longer being watched on the street. The feeling of being followed, which had haunted me since finding the diary, disappeared. I felt protected. But the strangest thing happened. A week after the ritual, Anna received a letter with no return address. Inside was only a sheet of paper with printed text. We welcome the return of the Kravtsov family to the game. We have missed you. Remember that the rules remain the same. Change or disappear by next spring. Of course, this could just be someone's cruel prank, Anna reasoned. Maybe someone found out about my search, about the diary, and decided to scare me. But how did they know about the game? That's the word the observer used in conversation with Stepan, something I haven't told anyone. Historian Melnik offers an alternative explanation. Perhaps the Kravtsov family was not the only one who followed this ritual. Maybe there is still a community of people in Kharkiv who continue the tradition of changing names, and they somehow found out about Anna's discovery and decided to contact her. Anthropologist Kovalenko adds, history knows of cases where secret societies or closed groups have existed for centuries, passing on their traditions from generation to generation. This is especially true for groups that have historically been persecuted and have developed mechanisms for protection and covert existence. But whatever lies behind this story, paranormal phenomena, psychological phenomena, or a secret society, one thing remains certain. Anna's discovery has raised many questions about her family's past, and possibly about the history of all of Kharkiv, to which there are no clear answers yet. I continue to investigate this mystery, Anna says. I have found several other descendants of the families mentioned in Stepan's diary. Some of them still live in Kharkiv. Others have scattered across different cities and countries. And, most interestingly, many of them tell similar stories about strange family traditions, about spring rituals, about unexplained disappearances of relatives who forgot to observe the tradition. One such story particularly impressed Anna. A descendant of the Zarin family, the very family to which the disappeared Mikhail Zarin belonged, told her that in their family, a legend had been passed down from generation to generation about a great-grandfather who dissolved into thin air after ridiculing old superstitions. In our family, we always told the children, "Never laugh at what you don't understand. Remember what happened to Mikhail Zarin," he told Anna. "I always thought it was just a scare tactic for disobedient children, but now that you've shown me Kravtsov's diary, I'm starting to wonder if it's all true." Psychiatrist Berezna warns about the danger of mass hysteria. When people start sharing such stories, a reinforcement effect occurs. Each new story strengthens belief in the reality of the described phenomena. This can lead to the formation of collective delusions, where a group of people sincerely believes in the existence of supernatural phenomena or conspiracies. However, criminologist Vishnevsky notes, we cannot rule out that behind all these stories lies a very real practice of persecuting certain groups of people. History knows many examples of people disappearing without a trace because of their nationality, religion, or political views. In the Russian Empire of the late 19th century, such cases were not uncommon, especially in relation to religious dissidents and national minorities. But what will happen if the Kravtsov story becomes public knowledge? If people learn about creatures who have supposedly lived among them for centuries, watching and choosing victims? Anna hesitated for a long time before deciding to share her discovery with journalists and researchers. I understand that many will perceive this story as a fabrication or the result of mass hysteria, she says. But what if it's true? What if the story of the ritual helps someone else protect themselves from disappearing? I can't keep this knowledge to myself. Historian Melnik is more cautious in his assessments. The history of the Kravtsov family is certainly of interest to researchers, but we must approach it critically, separating facts from mystical interpretations. Documented cases, name changes, and disappearances of people require a rational explanation, which may lie in the socio-political situation of that time, and not in the realm of the supernatural. However, regardless of what explanation is ultimately accepted by the scientific community, the history of the Kravtsov family has already become part of Kharkiv's urban folklore. People have begun to notice strange shadows in old photographs, to tell stories about encounters with tall figures in black who watch them on the streets. This is a classic example of how urban legends are born, explains anthropologist Kovalenko. A story that has some real basis is overgrown with mystical details and begins to live its own life. In a few years, it will no longer be possible to separate truth from fiction. And what about Anna herself? After she performed the ritual and received the strange letter, her life seemed to return to normal. She continued the restoration of the old house, planning to open a small museum of Kharkiv history there. But from time to time, she noticed strange things. Shadows moving too fast for the human eye, figures watching her from afar, whispers behind her back when no one was nearby. Sometimes I think I'm going crazy, like Stepan may have gone crazy, she admits. But then I remember that all the members of our family who observed the ritual lived long lives without unexplained disappearances, and I decide that it's better to be a little crazy than to disappear without a trace. Spring is approaching, and Anna is preparing to perform the ritual again, to choose a new name, to become someone else, even if only symbolically. She does not know if this will protect her from the mysterious observers, or whether they even exist, or whether it is all just a figment of her great-grandfather's imagination, passed down to her through a century. but she prefers not to risk it. In the end, she says with a sad smile, we all change with time. Every spring, we become slightly different people. Maybe the Kravtsov ritual is just a way to recognize this eternal truth and come to terms with it. And the shadows in the old photographs continue to observe, patiently, waiting for those who forget to change their name when spring arrives.